Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you, and thank you very much indeed for those kind words. I'm a huge supporter of History Reclaimed, and not just because it gave me the prize. It really is a fabulous organisation, and those of you who are in the room who support it, many thanks and congratulations to you. And thank you also, Robert, for mentioning my peerage. I was appointed by Boris Johnson and confirmed by Queen Elizabeth II, and then reappointed by Liz Truss and reconfirmed by King Charles III. And not since the Wars of the Roses has it taken 4 heads of state and heads of government to make a peer. I'd like to talk about Winston Churchill's present reputation, the state of his reputation, because of course he has been under this enormous attack from revisionists over the past few years. And so I'd like to do that and leave plenty of time for Q&A, because I know it's something that does interest and I think it's something that you feel is important, and so we can talk about it really at length. But I'd like to start actually not by talking about Churchill, but giving you a quotation from the screenwriter of the recent movie Napoleon. You remember that terrible movie that came out quite recently with the appalling screenplay in it? Well, the gentleman who wrote that screenplay, and I don't want to be personal about him because I've never met him, but nonetheless it was obviously dreadful. He said of the process of writing it, "How are we going to do this? Are we going to do a traditional prestige picture? It struck me that it's almost impossible to make that kind of movie any longer. Like Lawrence of Arabia or Gandhi, these are great movies, but the time for that kind of thing is pretty much ended." Now, ladies and gentlemen, isn't that a profoundly sad and pessimistic thing? The idea that one can make biopics about great men and women in history is a profoundly sad one, in my view. What it does is to imply that there are no great men and women, that really history is just the story of what T.S. Eliot called vast impersonal forces, and then the individual doesn't matter in history. It's also, I think, a way of making remarks like that, of projecting our own smallness and the smallness of our own times upon the past. And the question is really, is there really no place for greatness anymore? What if we only concentrate, as the revisionists do, on the clay feet of great men and women and not on their achievements? Churchill made any number of mistakes. There is no history book, no biography of Churchill, however hagiographical, that doesn't point out that he got things wrong. He got the abdication crisis wrong, he got the timing and the level of the gold standard wrong, he got the black and tans support in Ireland wrong, he got primarily, of course, the Gallipoli campaign, the Dardanelles campaign, badly wrong, and there are other examples of that. But if one concentrates solely on that, as some of the revisionist historians and biographers have, one closes one's eyes to the extraordinary things that he got right, including, in fact, primarily, in my view, seeing the way that Europe was going in 1914 and making sure that the Royal Navy was ready for any eventuality at the time of the outbreak of the Great War, and then spotting Hitler and the Nazis for what they were, the first person to do so really in frontline politics, and for many years the only person who was making that case and making it as eloquently as only Winston Churchill could. And then after the Second World War, in his great Iron Curtain speech of the 5th of March 1946, being able to identify the third great threat that totalitarianism posed to peace, civilization and democracy in Europe, which was, of course, the Soviet threat posed by Joseph Stalin. To be able to get all 3 of those things right, the 3 most important acts of Themistoclean foresight right in 1 century is in itself, I think, truly remarkable. And instead, of course, of celebrating that, the detractors concentrate on pretty much anything that can drag him down. There's recently been a book, a well-researched book, I admit, and quite a well-written book as well, by a lady called Anna Reid about the Russian Civil War, in which Churchill is essentially the villain of this book, and of course it was a disastrous intervention ultimately. It cost thousands of British lives. We were unable to overthrow the Bolshevik government, and we had to leave ultimately in 1922 with our tails between our legs. 21 with our tails between our legs. But ladies and gentlemen, does that really detract from, as the book seems to be intending to do, from the fact that Winston Churchill correctly spotted that Bolshevism was going to lead to absolute cataclysm in the 20th century? There are some 100 million people who were killed by communism in the 20th century. So was it not a perfectly reasonable stance for Churchill to take to try, in his words, to strangle Bolshevism in its cradle? I would argue that it certainly was, and that this can't be put down as yet another one of his errors. And even if it was an error, as Churchill said to his wife Clementine in the January of 1916 from the trenches, he said, "I would have made nothing if I had not made mistakes." And the great thing about Churchill is that he learned from his mistakes, all of them, all of the ones that I've just mentioned, and more. He learned from. And that was absolutely key when it came to creating the grand strategy that made Britain one of the victors in the Second World War. And when you see his learning process and the way in which he learned from his mistakes, it's truly extraordinary. And yet, even in this general election, only a few days ago, we had one of the candidates in Battle down in Sussex saying that West Sussex, I think, East Sussex, isn't it? Saying that Churchill's leadership was abysmal, and that his strategy was abysmal. It later turned out that the chap thought that we should have made peace with Hitler in 1940. So as far as he's concerned, it probably was abysmal for us to carry on fighting. But nonetheless, the idea that Churchill's leadership, which was in fact sublime in 1940 and 41 and through to 1945, can be described as abysmal by a parliamentary candidate. Let alone his strategy, because overall the grand strategy of ensuring that the cross-channel attack, which he always considered absolutely necessary, even from 1940, from the time of Dunkirk, when we were flung off the continent, he always knew that we had to come back at some stage. That was why he worked on the Mulberry Harbours, that was why he worked on the pipeline under the ocean, and so on. Nonetheless, that strategy, which ensured that we didn't cross the Channel again until there was air superiority and victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, and the huge supplies all across southern England were ready to cross the English Channel. Those are, and instead, of course, concentrating on expelling the Germans and Italians from the North African littoral by the summer of 1943, and then crossing over into Italy and fighting up Italy in the summer of 1944 until the point of the fall of Rome in June 1944, when the very next day, on the 6th of June, D-Day could be launched. Now, that isn't abysmal strategy, that's inspired strategy. That's the kind of strategizing that, working, of course, very closely with the Chief of the Imperial General Staff, Sir Alan Brooke, later Lord Alan Brooke, the Field Marshal, is a war-winning strategy. And it does seem extraordinary, but nonetheless, the very fact that Winston Churchill is still a factor in a general election so many years after his death is in itself a kind of tribute to him. I noticed yesterday that Nigel Farage was tweeting about how one of Winston Churchill's descendants. In fact, he's not a descendant. He's the Duke of Marlborough. He's a cousin. Has come out in favour of the Reform Party, and that has led several members of the actual Churchill family, the descendants of Churchill, to say that Reform shouldn't use Churchill's name, shouldn't bandy it around as an element in this election. It just shows that this man still is a relevant figure, and that you can't cancel Winston Churchill, however much the detractors would like to be able to do that. Geoffrey Wheatcroft, for example, Tariq Ali, people who've actually brought out books on Churchill. Fantastically ill-researched, both of them, by the way. The numbers and mistakes of just completely ridiculous errors that both Geoffrey Wheatcroft and Tariq Ali allowed into their books, which ultimately must undermine any sort of trust one has in the overall message of those books. But nonetheless, they're still being written. On the other side, on the other hand, we have a whole slew of pro-Churchill books, ones by Sita Stelzer and Katharine Carter. Katharine, the curator at Chartwell at the moment. There are books on Churchill's pets. There are books that come out year in on his friends, on his family, and so on, speaking to an underlying, continuing interest in him. More and more people go to Chartwell. Every year there was an American warship named after Churchill recently. The fact is that the detractors, they've made their point, and of course on occasion they'll even do it with spray cans on the statue of Parliament Square. But what they haven't done is to persuade the great majority of the British people who are still proud of Winston Churchill. And not just the British people. In Calgary, in Alberta last week, a statue went up to Winston Churchill, very fine statue actually, it looks magnificent. There were a few demonstrators outside, and when the Canadian Broadcast Corporation asked what they were demonstrating about, none of them could answer. It's fascinating. Oh, please do look it up. Look it up on YouTube. It's hilarious, actually, when the guy goes up, puts the microphone under the mouth of 4 demonstrators in a row, and not one of them could say anything about Winston Churchill. Which was rather pleasing. You'll see in the paper yesterday and today about a letter of Winston Churchill's to his maths teacher, Charles Mayo, thanking him for teaching him maths, even though he hated maths and was useless at it, but managed to get him into Sandhurst as a result. But how many other prime ministers, ladies and gentlemen, or indeed how many other British political figures would there be an article in the Times yesterday, for example, on a letter to a maths teacher going up for sale at auction? It strikes me as one of those. He's one of those very few people. He's up there with the greats, with the Abraham Lincolns and Franklin Roosevelts, and in publishing terms, Jesus Christs, who can still sell books and interest people. The week before last, there was a very generous and rich American businessman called Shannon Spector, who gave the Victory Jug to the Imperial War Museum, to the Churchill Museum in London. The Victory Jug was given to Churchill by the War Cabinet. It's a lovely silver jug with a inspiring inscription, and it was given to him at a War Cabinet meeting in November 1942. And it's a beautiful thing. But how many other prime ministers? There was a reception given at Winfield House by the American ambassador. How many other British prime ministers would the American ambassador give a big reception in honour of, essentially, and the passing over of a jug? It's something we have. He is a extraordinary national asset in that soft power that we always keep hearing about, and so I think we should be very proud of that. What we in all of these books, of course, which I mentioned about Churchill that come out, there hasn't been a new cradle to the grave single volume life of Churchill, and I don't think we need one for many years until mine goes out of print. The key issue, therefore, is I don't believe you can cancel Winston Churchill. The movie The Darkest Hour shows that Mr. Scarpa, David Scarpa, is wrong when he essentially says you can't make movies about great men and women any longer. That's simply not the case. And there is also, of course, what Ridley Scott said. I noticed there are a few children present, so I'm not going to say the exact quote, but essentially this was Ridley Scott talking about historians in his Napoleon movie. He said, "Effing historians, what do they know? They weren't there." Which is, obviously true. No, we weren't around 200 years ago to ask to be told by Napoleon what to write. However, there were hundreds, literally hundreds, probably in Napoleon's case, thousands of people who were there, who did write down what was happening, who recorded his remarks and so on. The role of history, therefore, is still worthwhile. And you can't just do everything on the basis of contemporary thought. History, said Churchill, in that fabulous speech that he gave in Westminster Abbey, the funeral oration for Neville Chamberlain in November 1940. And it was a freezing cold in there because A, it was November, and B, of course, they'd taken down all the stained glass windows to protect them at the outbreak of war, and had put up hoardings, and so it was very cold, and everyone was wearing their overcoats. And Churchill went up to the lectern, and he started his speech with this: "History, with its flickering lamp, stumbles along the trail of the past, trying to reconstruct its scenes, to revive its echoes, and kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days." Utterly wonderful, that single sentence, the use of the adjectives, the subclauses, the images that it conjures up. Weren't we lucky to have somebody with a capacity for the English language to be leading us at that time in 1940? And he's so right. And what we have to do is stay objective. Always stay objective. Put the historical facts before any preconceptions, especially political and ideological preconceptions that we historians might have. Go to the sources. In Winston Churchill's case, of course, the most wonderful sources here in this city, the Cambridge Archives, the Churchill Archive Centre at Churchill College, is this extraordinary cornucopia of literally millions of pages of first-hand documents. Then the other thing we've got to do, and it's so obvious, it seems to me, but so often ignored, is to remember that the past is another country, that the people in the past did not see the world in exactly the same way as we do. And to assume anything else is obviously illogical. And yet people again and again seem to forget that. It's like sort of asking, complaining really about Oliver Cromwell, that he didn't believe in socialised medicine. You have to see that the past is exactly that. It's the past, and if you're going to judge people, you need to judge them according to the mores of the day. So let's reclaim history, ladies and gentlemen, proper history writing, so that we can at least make an attempt to kindle with pale gleams the passion of former days. Thank you very much.
So I think we do need to look at what's going on in the actual history curriculum in schools. Now, clearly the Gove reforms that came in 2011, 2012 have been heralded as adding certain substance. I think there was a lot positive that was at least attempted there. And it's very interesting to track how perhaps the spirit of what Gove intended. But of course, much depends upon the knowledge and the enthusiasm of individual teachers. Now, this report, I think that fact of depending much upon the interest, the knowledge and enthusiasm of individual teachers really paves the way for politics to enter the classroom, for teachers with particular causes to pursue their own hobby horses. And this comes across in schools as a whole. So one school that's highlighted at this report teaches history in a thematic way. You know, this is very common. But the particular themes that this school discusses are power, religion, society, and empire. And you can see even within that choice of themes, there's a certain political element and the possibility for politics and political views to come in. Diversity has become a key goal of history teaching. 2021 research conducted by the universities of Oxford and Reading found that 87%, I mean, that's as near as damn it every school, as far as I'm concerned, 87% of secondary schools have made substantive changes to their history curriculum to account for diversity, to enhance diversity, increase diversity. And the reasons cited in this report are a sense of social justice, to better represent the nature of history and the stimulus of recent events. And I think the two key phrases that stand out for me in that sentence are social justice. This has become a key driver of all of education, it seems, but history in particular, and the stimulus of recent events. So rather than looking to the past as what's important that we should be teaching about history, the starting point is the present. What's important in the present that we need to read back into the past so that we can find lessons for today. So in this research, 72% claimed classes covered the history of migration, 80% said there was a focus on Black and Asian British history, and the biggest focus of all was on the post-war period. Now, just to clarify, I don't think there's anything wrong with any of this at all. You know, I think it's important to teach the history of migration. I think the problem is when this is taught in with the focus being on diversity, and as a kind of identity politics position, you're not necessarily teaching migration in the context of a British chronology, in the context of a national story. It becomes one topic amongst many. Back to Ofsted briefly. One of the quotes that really struck me, that really stood out from this 2023 Ofsted report that ties in with what I've just been talking about, it says in nearly half of schools, so this is, half of schools, teachers expected pupils to make their own judgments on sources of evidence without having developed secure historical knowledge to do this meaningfully. So I think that's a really fundamental and important criticism that's being made by Ofsted of the school history curriculum, that children are being expected to judge the past without a meaningful basis of historical knowledge. The purpose of the past, the purpose of history teaching in half of schools is to get children to judge, to get children to find wanting. I actually don't believe the bit in the Ofsted sentence that I just read out where it says to make their own judgments. I think when the nature of teaching is priming children with the right judgments, the right answers when they're being asked to pass judgment, and this becomes the purpose. But of course, the curriculum is actually only half the story when it comes to children's lessons in history, particularly in relation to schools, but in relation to broader culture. We need to look at what other messages children are getting about the past, about the nature of history from schools. And one way in which children picked up on cultural messages about history, certainly from my own experience of schooling, just a bog standard state school, was in the names of houses, the kind of competitive houses that you would get. And there's a very recent Telegraph headline, I think it's very revealing. It says, "Out with Churchill, in with Greta." It's talking about the name of the houses for schools. Out has gone Drake, Raleigh, Nelson, and in has come Rashford House, Greta House, and Malala House. And again, it pushes children into a permanent present. You know, Marcus Rashford, he might be a hero today. You know, I mean, I don't think he is even anymore, personally. Not since this house was named Rashford, but it sends a message to children that these historical figures, they are deserving only of contempt. You know, they have nothing to offer us. And I think, of course, then schools are part of broader society, and this same attitude towards history and towards the past is reflected in children's broader society, the broader culture that children are moving in. I don't know if people saw it. There was a very good article in The Spectator, I think probably about this time last week, looking at children's history books and kind of harking back to the Ladybird books that children had when they were my generation would have had, where even the illustrations were something very detailed, very accurate, very objective, very inspiring. And the stories were full of fact and detailed content, but were written with a kind of a genuine passion for the past. And you compare that to the horrible histories that children have today, which are kind of cartoon figures, cartoon illustrations, just focus on the kind of the grossest, yuckiest bit. And it's not a serious attempt to engage children with the past. It's just, again, this aim to kind of gross them out with some yucky things that used to happen. Again, you're looking at the past as a kind of political point scoring exercise, how backward, how stupid, how gross people once were. You know, you take your young people to museums then, and they've got lots of interactive stuff going on. It's, to me, some of them seem like an indoor playground, you know, where children are encouraged to go and, again, play, smell, scratch and sniff, engage with the past in that way, but nothing substantive, nothing inspiring, nothing that they can really get stuck into in terms of what the point was about. So I think that by the age of 18, children have learned that the past is a bit gross, that all it's really there for is for us to judge it and find it wanting, and useful for us to prove our own progressive credentials in the present. So when you think, if that's the point that young people have reached by 18, what strikes me as quite surprising is not how few people are going on to do history at undergraduate, but actually how many are making that decision. I think the other side of this coin then is what they're not getting. They're not getting a coherent national story. They're not getting an understanding of the past in all its nuance. I'm certainly not somebody who suggests we only need to teach people the good bits or national pride, but they're not getting any kind of balance or very little balance there. And I think crucially, they're not getting a kind of socialisation through that story that connects them to their own past history, their own past generations, gives them a sense of belonging to the society that they've been born into.
So, first of all, I think there was a certain element of underestimating the nature and extent of the problems in the last session. I love the Churchill, the history bit, but I think in the broader discussion there is a worrying element of underestimation that I hope to sort of illustrate in what I'm going to talk about. Schools have two main duties, right? Only two. You'd think they could get it right. First is to educate the next generation. This involves selecting the best content according to epistemological criteria and knowledge perhaps from other spheres. You know, we're not talking about history professors. We're talking about teachers who are dealing with a younger generation who have not yet, you know, not born with the capacity to think abstractly. That's something that develops. So other disciplinary knowledge is also required to be a good teacher. The second duty is to socialise the next generation. Now, according to the current crop of mainstream party leaders, and in fact, sadly, most leaders in education, this could mean anything from ensuring pupils have a clutch of generic skills to make them work ready for jobs that actually don't even exist yet, unspecified jobs for some unspecified future, or teaching toddlers how to brush their teeth. In fact, if we look to the established literature relevant to this, sociology and philosophy of education, if we look to say what Durkheim had to say on this, his classic description of socialisation through education involves habituating pupils into habits and dispositions through which they come to experience the reality of their society's moral norms. Okay, that's quite a sophisticated, subtle definition there that really bears thinking about. Has a very long tradition. It goes back to Plato, right? So it stood the test of time. It has little to do with using schools and children as social engineering experiments to create any particular government or any particular educational professions, particular political utopia. When it comes to what actually goes on in schools, what is taught, who decides? Unfortunately, it is not us here in this room. And actually, it's not even government politicians. It's not really any single person, right? It's not the cultural Marxists. It's not the far-right professors, as some would have us here. It's actually it's shaped by things that are going on, things that people are saying and doing in three different spheres that if you think of as concentric circles, right? We have the official sphere. That's the government, basically, and the leaderships of the exam boards. Down the road, if you go to Cambridge Assessment, it's like going into Fort Knox. You literally, if you go to the toilet, if you're in the archives, you go to the toilet, you have to be escorted to the toilet, right? That's how kind of official and secret it is. So that's the official context. Then you have the professional context, exam boards and publishers and professional bodies, and then the pedagogic context, which is the schools, the local level, the local authorities and your school down the road. So, you know, three concentric circles with a pole running through them, which I hope that's very abstract, but I want to flesh that out now and look at some examples from these different spheres to make the argument that the problem we face is much more profound and much more widespread than I think is commonly realised or even perhaps realised here. So here we go. This is from an example this is from what I would call an example from the professional context. It's official guidance for teachers found in a GCSE document from a major exam board, Edexcel, published in conjunction with Pearson's, the publishers, and a body called the Black Curriculum. The Black Curriculum is one of many, many third-party organisations, equity, diversity, inclusion organisations that are now I would say they're pretty much established within the educational landscape. A-level and AS level. The specifications in history must encourage students to develop their interest in and enthusiasm for history and an understanding of its intrinsic value and significance. Well, who could disagree with that? Number two, second aims and objective, acquire an understanding of different identities within society and an appreciation of aspects such as social, cultural, religious and ethnic diversity as appropriate. This is not history. This is not educational knowledge. It is a political opinion. It may be a valid political opinion. It may be one you wish to discuss with somebody over a drink in a pub or argue at a public meeting. It is not something you put in the school curriculum in history, smuggling it in as if it were a historical fact when it isn't. It's an opinion. This is a serious erosion of the difference between epistemology, knowledge, different forms of knowledge, belief and opinion. The whole point of education since Plato's Republic has been to try and direct, for adults to try and direct the younger generation into being able to recognise, distinguish and articulate the differences between those three things: knowledge, belief and opinion. Each valid in its own sphere, each useful. We need all three, but we cannot have them muddled in the way that they are being muddled and blurred at the moment. So, next one. Sorry, I'm going to rush through a bit. So the next one is, this is from AQA exam board, very commonly used. I think it's the most popular exam board, but that is generally because it is the most easy to get a good result in. It's exam 1, specification, the British Empire. So we have, students have an option to, this allows students to study in breadth issues of change, continuity and cause and consequence in this period through the following key questions. Why did the British Empire grow and contract? What influenced imperial policy? What part did economic factors play in the development of the British Empire? How did the empire influence British attitudes and culture? How did the indigenous people, sorry, I'm from India, right? I do not think of myself as an indigenous person. How did the indigenous peoples respond to British rule? How important were the roles of key individuals and groups? And how were they affected by developments? Well, you know, that's kind of sort of okay-ish, but it's very dry, it's very, chunked up, and it's very narrow, right? There's no mention. I know there are people here who know about Britain's military history. How can you talk about empire and not talk about military, the development of the military? How can you talk about empire and economic factors? Do they mean the Industrial Revolution? Do they mean the East India Trade Company? What exactly? So it's very, very generic and not very inspiring at all. And this is the example, as I said. So let's see how this then this kind of thinking works through the different levels of curriculum. Oh, here we go. So now here, framing of knowledge. There's been a lot of people trying to counter this influence in education. Often say, well, you must teach, if you're teaching about what Britain did in the slave trade, then you must teach about what African nations did or the Ottoman Empire. I think that's a little bit misguided. I mean, certainly there does need to be that kind of explicit balance, I think, if you are using historians who have a particular known viewpoint. If God forbid you should use David Olusoga, then you should also make sure that you at the very least acknowledge that there are different interpretations of it, and at least do have the grace to mention Robert Toombs and Nigel Biggar and others. Okay, so a lesson plan, and then we come to the pedagogic sphere, what actually happens locally. As Joanne said, there's basically teachers can choose their own personal interests. It's called Dharmic Faiths. It was a lesson given to Year 10 in a philosophy lesson. There's not one iota of philosophy in it. It was the book that it's used from, the text it uses, is by an American academic whose field is geography. So, there you go. Multidisciplinarity, I suppose. So this is talking about the use of Britain's use of consensus. It's actually talking about the main message of this lesson is that Hinduism was relatively unknown in India until the British came and created it as a census category, which is a bit of a surprise to many Indians who are quite familiar with the Upanishads and various other ancient texts in which Hinduism is mentioned quite a lot. But hey, why let a historical fact get in the way of a good story, a good political story? The teacher, the parent who saw this did complain to the school. Well, not complain, they raised questions. They did very politely, very gingerly raised questions about why their child was being taught this by a geography teacher in a lesson that was supposed to be about philosophy, which was sort of factually very inadequate, to say the least. The parent was, there was a long process of toing and froing, but essentially nothing happened. The parent was fobbed off. And eventually, as you would do, you kind of give up, because who do you go to? Who do you go to about this? Who has oversight of this? Right? Ofsted won't deal with it. Ofsted will only deal with kind of procedural irregularities, not substantive ones like this. The DFE, they'll pass you on to the EHRC. The EHRC will pass you on to somebody else. So no wonder this kind of thing just goes on, with people getting more and more angry and frustrated, but feeling unable to do anything about it.
Alka.
Sorry, I'll stop there.
Well,
I think I've made my point. You've seen the kind of process of indoctrination.
I think you've worried us very effectively. But thank you very much for those examples, which are very telling.
The thing is that I sit in here and think, oh my goodness, to talk about great films like that, or not like, Napoleon isn't a great film, and I don't suppose many historians would think the film Titanic was a great film with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet. But I imagine that I think about that film and I think about when the boat was straight up and Kate and Leonardo were hanging on. That's where we are, okay? That's where we are. So I've been shouting about this for 2 decades. And when I first started, we just hit the iceberg. The ship is up, right? That's where we are. And for 2 decades, people say I'm exaggerating and being silly. It's just that I have a different vantage point than you, right? So what I see from my colleagues in the schools I visit and so on, I'm not making this stuff up, and I've been shouting about it for 2 decades. What Joanne and Alka have been saying, absolutely spot on. I just want to ring the alarm bells even louder. So, Lawrence, can we put, we need to do the, there. So one of my teachers, I said, well, let me give you some examples to try and persuade you. One of my French teachers, during my teacher training, this is before she came to me, there was much talk of decolonization, and we were warned about the frequent racism we would encounter in French textbooks. This is an example of a racist textbook at my old school, as flagged up by a white colleague of mine who was doing an MA on decolonizing the language curriculum. So this racist textbook is simply saying here, 25% of young people have access to the internet, 35% have access, 50%, etc. And then there's various different countries across Africa, and you're meant to know the French words for 50% or 60% and so on, and then figure it out. But this apparently is racist. Now, this is a little conversation between a couple of young people online. And fascinating, how did you compare it to the class game? They're talking about the poetry that they need to compare in their GCSE. And, this one's saying what she chose. And then this one says, I chose that poem because I'm working class, so it was easy for me to waffle about. And she says, lived experience and all that. And then she says, oh, I did a great job with my lived experience because I got an 8. So remember, at GCSEs, you can get a 1 to a 9. 9 is the top 3% of the country. So an 8 is the old A star. It's a very, very good grade. And she's saying, brilliant, I'm working class. I talked about being working class. I talked about my lived experience. And so I got an 8. And this refers exactly to what you're saying, Andrew, earlier. When Ridley Scott's saying, well, the historians weren't there, what he's saying is they don't have any lived experience. This is what everyone thinks. If you don't have lived experience, then you don't have a right to an opinion. And this girl had lived experience and therefore got an 8 in her exam. Well, let me tell you about one of the London independent day schools. Now, these are schools where you pay about £27,000 a year to go. Many of them are doing similar things to this. So this isn't an exception. This is the rule. In this London day school, Lawrence, they have abandoned all teaching of Shakespeare. There is no Shakespeare that is taught. People are paying £27,000 a year to avoid Shakespeare being taught to their children. Instead, they are teaching the great works of Panty Bliss, the drag queen. I kid you not. I mean, this is true. They have abandoned Shakespeare. They're teaching the great works of the drag queen Panty Bliss. If these wigs could talk, you can see how she or he is giving great, competition to Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? This is the reality of our schools. Lawrence, please. Here is another London day school, some £27,000 that you will be paying. Diversity Day, you have diversity weeks. Diversity Day is finally here, 25 to 21st. Events happening all week. Oh, it is all week that you might be interested in. Blah, 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 blah. These are the sorts of things that all of our schools are doing, and the private schools lead the state schools in terms of culture. The rest of us want to copy them. And I can tell you, I used to have a sign outside of Michaela that said, private school education for free. I took it down, okay? Now, even in maths, we have got racism and gender everywhere. So Morgan is playing a computer game. They can score 0, 1, 2, or 3 points. Now, who is they? Morgan is one person. And I can tell you, for children who are special needs, children who aren't, cognitively that advanced, it's difficult to understand that question. Similarly here, Charlie eats 2 of the apples. The apples that they eat weigh 58 grams and 66 grams. It's an impossible question to understand. This is the norm. This is taken from a GCSE exam. Lawrence. Now, history teaching. In 2023, 49% of kids took history GCSE. It's only as high as that because of all of the changes that Michael Gove made. He forces schools to choose between history and geography. I can tell you that his reforms are about to be abolished, right? So history will, Joe talked so eloquently there about how many people are doing history. I can tell you that's about to crash. Those numbers are actually quite high in comparison to what they will be in 3 or 4 years' time. Half the country depends on 1 or 2 50-minute history lessons for year 7, 8, and 9. That's what they're depending on. And I can tell you they don't get 50 minutes because there is chaos all over the place. The behavior is poor. The teaching standards are poor. The methods that they use to teach are poor. You're lucky if you're getting 20 or 30 minutes teaching once a week for those 3 years to learn your history. Now, here's an example of a sort of lesson that you might find in a very typical school. Churchill the hero, Churchill the villain. And you can imagine, well, what they write and whatever it is they're going to write depends on what their teacher has told them. And if the teacher is not a fan of Churchill, and I can tell you that there are many teachers who are not fans of Churchill, then the children will be writing that he's more of a villain than he is a hero. But at least the children who are being taught this lesson will know who Churchill is, depending on the way in which it's taught. I mean, to be honest, when I think back to my old school where I was teaching, and I'm talking about 20 years ago, it wouldn't mean that they weren't taught about Churchill. They would have been. But if you have poor behavior, if poor teaching methods, if no one's listening in the lesson, then you're not really committing that knowledge to memory. Because when I was teaching my class, I taught French, and I happened to mention Churchill, and they were 15 years old. And I said, Churchill, and they sort of looked at me. And I said, Churchill? We know who Churchill is, isn't it? Don't we? And they looked at me. And then one of them said, oh, he's that dog. And I said, what dog? And I understood that there was Churchill Insurance, of course, and they all understood, because in those days, he used to be on the television all the time, and that was who Churchill was for them. So there are those who think Churchill's a villain, and then there are those who think he's a dog. Lawrence. Now, what they do, now these are the better schools, I would say, that have more of a knowledge-based curriculum, but the knowledge that they are teaching is rather biased, I would say. I've come to realize that the word reveal, all of these, you look at the resources, and these are coming from standard textbooks. What does this reveal about X, Y, and Z? A golden country, the Empire of Mali. What does the story of Mansa Musa reveal about medieval West Africa? It's always either, well, he's the richest man in the 14th century in the world, and oh, you didn't know that, did you? And other ways in which they reveal. What do the stories of the often forgotten armies reveal about the Western Front? Well, guess what it reveals? It reveals that the British are really very, very racist. Here's an example of one of the stories from the same textbook. What does the story of Genghis Singh reveal about the Western Front? Now, Genghis Singh, the Indians was fought in the First World War. This is interesting and something that ought to be taught to some extent, obviously, when teaching. When I say to some extent, you don't want it to be all about the oppressed peoples of the colonial empire fighting for the British, and that all that we want to teach them is how badly they were treated. You want to teach them all kinds of things about the First or the Second World War, and then as part of that, you would include some of that information. These are stories that are told. So Singh's regiment, meanwhile, has just 2 machine guns and no grenades because, of course, the racism prevented them from having guns. And that meant that all they had was a jam jar filled with dynamite. So the way children's minds work is they then remember the jam jar. Of course they remember the jam jar, and they remember that the British are racist and that the poor Indian soldiers only had jam jars, whereas the white British soldiers had guns. That is what they are being taught. And so in the end, when these ethnic minority children are being taught these things, they're being taught to hate their country. That's what we need to understand. And I'm taking this from standard textbooks. He's being spoken to in an unintelligible language. It wasn't unintelligible at all. It was English, and he would have understood it. Ganga Singh, in fact, was a Maharaja. This is not mentioned in here. In fact, he feels a sense of dislocation, of isolation, and of loss. I mean, look, I can imagine that many of the soldiers on the Western Front felt like that because they were in the Western Front. So one of my teachers who taught in another school and taught all of this, he told me about this. And because he was so annoyed about it, he asked the children after they'd done their period on the First World War, he asked them in a survey afterwards, he inserted, because they were being surveyed on it generally, and he managed to get 2 questions in on who won the First World War, and 33% of them knew who had won the First World War. And when was the First World War? So 14, 18, those, very standard thing that you would just take for granted. Only 80% of them knew. Let's say these children were not from challenging backgrounds, but they did not know this stuff. Because when you're taught in this fashion, and you talk about the way in which things are taught, children remember the jam jar. They don't remember anything else. They believe historical teaching should reflect a child's ethnic or sexual identity. That's how they think. This is when Joe was talking about identity politics. They see everything through the lens of race or sexuality or gender. The teacher has to jump around and can never build a cohesive chronological narrative. And it means they learn less, like far, far less if you don't have chronology when learning history. History is the most important way that you can build a cohesive society. Why should I trust someone who looks different to me? Because we share something in common. We are all British. The only way we can build trust across racial and religious divides is by knowing the history of our country. But our children do not know the history of our country. So what happens at Michaela? At my school, I'm going to show you, it's not like we don't teach about Black people, about, all of this is included. I couldn't possibly show you our lesson on Churchill because that's an absurd way of teaching. We wouldn't teach a lesson on Churchill. He'll appear at different points in events as we're teaching, right? He just appears every now and again. That's how history should be taught, but it isn't taught like that. So, Lawrence, thank you. Here's one example of all of our resources we created ourselves. We've had to write the stuff ourselves. We wouldn't dare use ordinary textbooks because they're all terrible, okay? So, like when I say they're all terrible, they're all terrible. And all of the children in Britain are being taught from these textbooks, okay? Or you go to Oak National, which is a government-sponsored, money was given to them to create these crazy resources that are out there that I look at and just think online, and I just think, how can it be that this is what we're teaching children with, and we're teaching teachers to use? So, causes of the First World War. That's a good lesson, right? Because in 1914, the First World War broke out. This war changed the world forever. New technology changed the way that wars were fought. This is what a lesson should look like, right? Why was the First World War known as a world war? When did the First World War happen? Those kinds of questions that you all would imagine are normal, they're not normal. Lawrence. Here's another one, the Battle of the Somme, 1916. And then we explain what the battle was. When was it? Who won the battle? These are the questions that we are highlighting and making the focus of the lesson. Lawrence, now, it doesn't mean that we don't talk about Black people. Britain's army, millions volunteered from across Britain to fight for their country, to support her in the conflict with Germany, etc. Here's a veteran from the Second World War. Lawrence, thank you. The British Raj, all about here, right? We say here, their racist beliefs. Racism is the belief that other races of people are not as good as your own. Mixing with the indigenous was seen as dangerous and dirty. It's not that we don't teach this stuff. It's just in and amongst the history that we are teaching. Lawrence, thank you. The scramble for Africa in the late 19th century. Other European countries wanted to build empires, blah, blah, blah. Lawrence, thank you. The Amritsar massacre. We go into that. Lawrence, thank you. Here, we're talking about Alan Turing. And again, we see homosexuality was illegal at the time. The pain of being punished for simply being himself pushed him to end his own life. It was a sad end for one of Britain's true wartime heroes. It's not that we don't include these things. They're there. But one, I'm the strictest headmistress in Britain, so our children are listening. Our children are there on time. Our children are able to learn huge amounts of history in comparison to what children are learning elsewhere. Lawrence, thank you. What does this mean for culture at Michaela? Lawrence, thank you. So, the other day, England against Denmark, we had the kids come back in for 5 o'clock. Here we are in various different classrooms watching the England match. We have got England flags everywhere. The children are wearing their England tops. They're, flying their England flags, and we had a wonderful time together. It transforms what a school can be like. And the thing is, it was so sad for me to watch the day in a way, because I thought, imagine if every school in the country were like this. Imagine if all ethnic minorities could feel part of Britain in the way that our children do. Lawrence, thank you. Now, well, they've all memorized If. Rudyard Kipling. I remember Dominic Lawson from The Times came to visit the school once, and he heard the children belting it out, and he said, "Katharine, are you doing this deliberately to be controversial?" And I said, "Why?" And he said, "But they're ethnic minorities, and you're getting them to read If, and it's Kipling." And I said, "Well, yes. And Kipling's great, and so is If, and you might have an interesting discussion at university about Kipling's racism or whatever you might want. I don't care. I've got a bunch of 12-year-olds, and we are learning the poem If because it's a wonderful poem. And then when England wins or loses, we can talk about triumph and disaster, and it means something to them because they've learned it before with If." Lawrence, thank you. And now here, I thought coming to the end, I'm going to show you a little video at the end here, but Roger Scruton, he came to visit us, talk to the kids about fox hunting, because I thought, well, we didn't know anything about fox hunting. And he tried to persuade us that fox hunting was a good thing, and my little year sevens were looking up at him. And he said, well, ladies who want to wear the fox, you can't let the dogs just tear the fox apart. You have to use a gun so you can shoot it in the middle of the head. And my little ones were so horrified. I thought, Roger, you have lost the argument at that point. But he said, I'm always very proud of this, because when I was at university, I used to read Roger Scruton and think, I don't understand a word of this. I still say that, actually. But the fact is, I have taught Roger Scruton something. And I'm very proud of it. I'm going to show you. Because he came to our school and he learned something. Visiting Michaela was, for me, a life-changing experience. The triumph of progressive, child-centered education and all the follies associated with it had led me to despair that our inner-city children would ever be able to obtain the knowledge that they need for a successful and socially integrated life. In Michaela, I saw that this despair is entirely unjustified, that good teachers can instill knowledge and discipline into every child, and that a school can be a happy and fruitful home to children of all kinds and of all origins. This book, so this is comment at the beginning of our book, lucidly explains the philosophy behind Michaela's approach, and its arguments are incontrovertible. Michaela is the model free school that all our schools should imitate. Now those are our year 11s. They had left, the exams had finished. They had left the school. They came back to celebrate and join together as our Michaela family because England were playing in the Euros. Now, that is what we need as a country. When you look at the country and you see the various marches or you see the anger that is coming out there, it is because of children being taught incorrectly in schools. Everybody talks about immigration. Everybody talks about these various issues. I am telling you that children are being taught to hate their country, not in a way that's deliberate. It's not deliberate. It is because of the textbooks that are out there. It is because sometimes teachers are taught themselves. They are taught to think that what we're meant to be doing is to teach children to stand up against the establishment, that the establishment is racist and sexist and so on and so forth. When they are 12, 13, 14, that is the time to learn some basic British history and geography, some basic science. Just so you know, one of my teachers, he was telling me he's examining right now the GCSEs. To get a pass at science GCSE, you need 17 marks out of 70. Okay, 17 out of 70. And he had marked some stuff wrong because it was obviously wrong. The senior examiner said to him, well, we know it's wrong, but we let it go. So ignore it, okay? People in this room, I don't know if we realize just how straight that ship is, okay? And how the Visigoths are at the gates, okay? So we need to find it in ourselves to understand. History reclaimed, you need to reclaim the country, okay? And you're not going to be able to reclaim the country if you're not informed about what's going on. And I am telling you, it's burning out there. We're in here, and it's all very lovely. But I've come here today to ring those alarm bells, just as they have come here today. Just like Frank was saying there, and he stood up, you'll hear from him later. We see things that you don't see. And it's all about schools. It's all about schools. Children are the future, right? They're the future. They're the future of any country. And if the schools are teaching them badly, then don't be surprised when you see the things that you see. Having said that, if we can get all the children doing this sort of thing, if we can get teachers and head teachers and so on doing what we do at Michaela, then there is hope yet. Thank you.
And the History Reclaimed Prize for 2024 is awarded to Noel Malcolm.
Thank you very much. I'm really honoured and delighted and indeed surprised to receive this prize. Particularly delighted because I have such a high opinion of History Reclaimed, what it stands for and what it's been doing. And I frequently log on to the website to see what new material has been put on. It's of high quality, the range is extraordinary, and I hugely appreciate the work put into it by its Holy Trinity of Robert and David and Lawrence. I mean, these don't organise themselves, a lot of work goes into that, and it's very much for the best. I'm surprised to receive this award for this book. You may be surprised because a book on the history of homosexuality you might think is exactly an example of that sort of trendy topic that gets foisted on students, even though in objective terms it relates to a pretty sort of marginal phenomenon in the past. But as was hinted just at the end of that very nice eulogy, there is a point here which aligns very much with History Reclaimed. I got into this topic completely by accident. I just found a fascinating document when I was working on something else in the State Archive in Venice. And one thing led to another. I thought I'd write an article. I had to read around the background of the whole issue because I'd never worked in this field before. And as I did so, I began to think, some pretty odd claims being made here. I did more work. The article became a book. It became quite a big book. But the key point is this. As I entered a field as a complete outsider and took what I hope is a really fresh look at the whole thing, I began to see that almost every aspect of the orthodoxy which dominates the textbooks, and believe me, there are entire textbooks on this subject now, the orthodoxy, every aspect of it was wrong. And the reason why it was wrong was essentially wishful thinking by modern historians. And the reason why they were doing so much wishful thinking was that since this topic became a matter of serious historical analysis starting in about the 1980s, almost everybody who's written on it has been not just gay, but a gay activist. And that is the problem, and that has generated a kind of retrospective activism into the past, which has just skewed the whole interpretation. So if my book has done some good, it will be, I think, very much in alignment with the most important aims of History Reclaimed, which is that we should take history on its own terms and not just use it as an object for exploitation by our own present concerns. Anyway, that's enough of me. Thank you again very, very much.
He often wrote in the Times Higher Education Supplement in the old days when it was actually rather an impressive publication and well worth reading. And a kind of radical sociologist. By radical, I mean somebody who seemed to have radically different ideas from his colleagues in sociology, was always an absolute delight to read. Frank, tell us about the war against the past.
Thank you very much, Lawrence, and I'm delighted that I could speak to this audience. I think very highly of History Reclaimed. because the work that's being done here is so essential, given the way in which our past is being negated and rendered morally inferior. Right, thank you very much. There's the silent version of me, which many people prefer, to what I'm going to be talking about now, which is basically about the war against the past. And I don't know about you, if you ever have that moment in your life when you look at your friend or your wife or your husband, usually when you listen to the Today program, and you say to yourself, either they're crazy or we're crazy. Right? And I always remember a story that was being discussed in all seriousness, where they were talking about Aristotle as being the father or the origin of white supremacy. And I didn't realize, even though I studied Aristotle as an undergraduate, that he was in the business of creating this white identity for us in the 21st century. And that all these great Greeks who we studied and loved their philosophy were actually these horrible individuals who were, in a sense, kind of building this kind of racist framework, which has been perpetuated through the centuries. But then when I heard this story, I realized that, I got to address this problem. Why is it that the past is being not only rewritten, because I think it's legitimate to rewrite history or to have a different interpretation of history, but what isn't legitimate is when you basically subject the past to what is more or less a kind of quasi-religious crusade, where you basically regard the past as this toxic region, this area that still infects us, that somehow renders us ill in the 21st century, and where literally anybody that lived in the past, no matter who they are somehow represented as being morally inferior to us. So there's an assumption that we know much better than they do, right? And that we're here to helpfully point out their horrible mistakes that they've been complicit in. And this often takes the most grotesque forms. Earlier on, Katharine was talking about the way that Shakespeare is often represented. But what she didn't mention is that there is now a veritable cottage industry devoted to rewriting Shakespeare, actually rewriting Shakespeare. So when you ask these people, for example, why is it that you've decided to rewrite Othello? It's a great play. It's wonderful tragedy. You kind of go away and think about the human conditions. What's wrong with Othello? Then you're told by the people who are doing this, it's because by making Othello, the language of Othello, sounds more racist, we're bringing to light what Shakespeare really meant. So what they are really saying is that in his heart of heart, the old bard was a member of the KKK, or something like the KKK in his time. He was a little bit reluctant to let the whole world know about it, and instead of explicitly using a racist vocabulary, he kind of hid his real intent. But we're going to help that out by changing the language, so we now know just exactly what Shakespeare was really all about. And there are a lot of people around in the academic world who are busy rewriting different authors from the past and making it relevant for the 21st century by showing their real intent. But they are really saying, and this is really the height of moral arrogance, that they know better than Shakespeare did what he was really writing about. In other words, they got this privileged insight into the life world of people that they've never met, they never encountered, which allows them to somehow bring to the surface their genuine thoughts that were hidden all this time. And this kind of historical rewriting of the past and the figures of the past is often makes its way into professional history. Now, I'm not a professional historian, although history is probably my first love. But I do know that there are certain sins that historians are not meant to commit. One of the sins and I remember this from my historiography classes, is you're not supposed to read history backwards. In other words, you're not supposed to use anachronism or think anachronistically. Now, it's okay for Shakespeare, the playwright, to anachronistically represent the Roman Empire as if it was in the 16th century. And you know, he talks about in Julius Caesar, the clock rings, and there were no clocks, as we all know, in Roman times. I think it's all right when you're a playwright to have that kind of literary license. But when historians basically take it upon themselves to use anachronism as a tool to interpret events. In other words, what they are really doing is they're interpreting the 14th, 15th century, even ancient Rome or ancient Greece, in accordance with the moral values of today. And they're basically judging individuals' behavior 2,000 years ago as if they were our peers. And not only just judging them, but actually reprimanding them. It's almost as if they feel that they got the right to put right the moral errors of somebody living in the 18th century. Someone like Adam Smith or any of the members of the Scottish Enlightenment are told that they were bad boys because they didn't think the way that we're doing. When you're using that kind of technique of anachronism, then in a sense, you're violating one of the most fundamental tenets of history. That's what I thought. Until I went to New York a couple of years ago, and I was involved in a debate with some of the historians who were defending this grotesque project on slavery that the New York Times was putting forward, where they basically argued that actually the United States was founded on slavery and nothing else, and the whole documents about freedom and everything else was just a cover for the fact that the reason why America separated from Britain was so that they can promote slavery more vigorously. So I was involved in this debate, and sometimes you think you've nailed it. I thought my arguments were great. I was expecting a standing ovation, which didn't happen. And I'm arguing against the guy, and I think I got him on the run when I accused him of anachronism. And instead of saying, Frank, you're wrong, I don't use anachronisms, anachronism is alien to me, he basically said, yes, actually, we are using anachronism. We are adopting an anachronistic discourse. And they actually call it anachronistic discourse. And the reason why we're doing it is because we think by reading history backwards, by actually subjecting the past to our values, we're doing a positive thing. That's a blow for freedom. We're acting in accordance with the latest ethos of social justice. And we, historians, have now got the right not just to simply interpret the past, but literally immerse ourselves into the past, as if we were living alongside Shakespeare, living alongside Adam Smith or Aristotle, and we're nudging them. We're physically nudging them and trying to correct their mistakes and get them to understand where they went wrong. And that kind of arrogance, and it is just pure arrogance, of doing this has now become legitimated even in the field of historiography by sections of the American Historical Association. That's a problem, because it basically means that history as a discipline, with its own rigorous premise and assumptions, it has now become, in a sense, subordinate to what history has become, which, to use a horrible American phrase, which is being adopted in England, as all these California values are being adopted in England, history has become storytelling, right? In my days, when I was a student, we used to call that bullshitting, where you kind of make it up as you're kind of going along. So that's really what historiography has become. And the thing that I kind of try to deal with in my book, in dealing with this, is that one of the consequences of this is that in the course of reading history backwards, the temporal distinctions between the present and the past, and by implication with the future, are being broken down. what people are doing more and more, and this is, you don't need to be a Black Lives Matter activist or a transgender ideologist. What people are doing is they kind of promiscuously allowing themselves to act as if they are living in the 18th, 19th century. And they're kind of more interested at the moment in fixing the problems of the past than in dealing with the problems of the present. I don't know if you've noticed, but one of the interesting things in the current era of the culture wars is that more and more and more of the clashes and the struggles in the culture war are not about things that are confronting us in the here and now. They're about fixing the problems of the past. More and more, you find that the language of the culture war changes so that words are being used in such a way as to discredit anything to do with the past, the historical sensibility that has emerged over the centuries. If you look very, very carefully, the phrases that people use is really interesting. You cannot go to a museum these days without coming across one of these trigger warning placards that tells you that these ideas that we're seeing here are outdated. Outdated. Now, I know what outdated means when I look at a yogurt, a pot of yogurt in my fridge, and it says on it to be eaten by April 2012, right? I know I'm in trouble, and I shouldn't be doing that. I know what outdated means in its conventional, everyday term, but when you have the suggestion that somehow the moral assumption of a 19th century philosopher like J.S. Mill or Bentham or anybody that lived at that time has ideas that are outdated, then what they really are saying is not just simply that we are ahead of them, that somehow we've learned through the experience of the past. What they're also saying is that we're better people. Right? That's the argument, that these people are lowlifes. You know, they don't have our awareness. And the word they always use to promote and justify their distortion of history, you probably come across it, is the one expression I hate more than anything else in the English language, is the expression is, we're raising your awareness. Right? And I know that, you know, whenever people say I'm raising your awareness, there's an assumption that they become moral gods, they, you know, the moral authorities. They're aware, and I'm not. You know, they're aware, but people in the past were quite clearly not aware. And when you have that kind of language that's being used all the time, then what you're doing is you pathologize the past. I mean, all these little words like, you know, at first I used to laugh at it, but I don't laugh anymore. When I hear discussions about dead white male, I mean, somehow it's not only disrespectful to the dead, right, but there's also an assumption that a dead white male, by definition, is somebody who you can ignore. And not only ignore, but is somebody that you can have contempt for because they are dead white male. And somehow when I go to the opera in Sydney, as I did, I love the opera and I expect to see, you know, proper operas. And then I'm being told that we're changing the program because unfortunately the repertoire of operas is based on the works of dead white male, right? Yeah. I mean, not about Mozart. They don't use Mozart. Don't about Beethoven or Bach, any of these people. They're just dead white male. What you've done is you've essentially sort of rendered toxic all these people. But speaking of toxicity, the past, when it's treated that way, is toxic. I mean, that's the basic assumption in the way that the past is treated at the moment. And when you have a toxic past, then people actually can claim to be suffering from it in the here and now. I always remember when those young activists who tried to get rid of the statue of Rhodes in Oxford were being interviewed. Many of them said that whenever I walk along in front of the statue of Rhodes, I get traumatized, right? I forget, I don't know what planet they're living on, sort of. But suddenly, all these people are explaining that, when I go into an old senior common room in Cambridge or Oxford, and I see all those kind of white or dead white males on the wall, I get traumatized, I get triggered. And there's a variety of psychological conditions that apparently are the result of being exposed to the poisonous sort of toxicity that emanates from the past. And the very fact that these claims are being treated seriously is itself something that's worth several PhD theses to write about. The very fact that our museums are no longer in the business of preserving their collection, which once upon a time, that's what museums did. You carefully cherished and you preserved your collection, but instead are in the business of taking it apart, deconstructing it, and demonstrating how horrible these exhibitions are. And when you go to a museum, and this is like everywhere. My wife and I are going to a museum in Lugano recently, and every painting, had a sign on it. It wasn't about the painting. It wasn't about the depth of color. It wasn't about the particular technique used by the artist. We were told about the bad behavior of the artist, right? Or we were told about the horrible conditions that people lived in at that particular time, their racism, their hostility to transgender people, and all the rest of that. So it's a very important phenomenon. The way in which the past is being colonized by people today is obviously related to identity. And it's identity politics that is driving this second occupation of the past. These days, I don't know if you noticed, you cannot talk about anything in the past without your pronoun being presented or without you being told something about the identity. These days, it gets to the point where if you have an archaeological dig and you happen to come across some human remains and you look at it and, beforehand when you had human remains, you'd do some tests, some DNA tests to first of all identify whether that's a man or a woman. Because in those days, they still had those categories, very binary categories of man and woman, right? These days, many archaeologists argue that it's wrong. It's totally wrong for us to endow these people with identities that they might have rejected. Because in this particular dig in Egypt, which goes back to the times of the Pharaoh, it may well be the case that this particular person who you and I will see as a man actually might have identified as something else, a different gender. I don't know how much discussion there was about genders in ancient Egypt, but according to these people, there must have been, because that's the way that, for example, somehow every time a woman is found in a grave, in a shallow grave or elsewhere, and this woman happens to have a sword next to her, or happens to have some kind of body armor on her, not just Joan of Arc, but others, the way they immediately are told, well, don't call her or she, because the very fact that she had a sword next to her indicates that she was ambivalent about her sexuality. And you can go on and on about these weird stories that have been made up, but what they are really all about is that by basically discovering that transgender ideology was flourishing in Sparta in 3,000-4,000 years ago, naturalizes and normalizes the identity. And what people are doing is, by reading history backwards, they're rooting themselves in this fictitious past where identity politics was already running and flourishing as a way of demonstrating that what they are, that in a sense, two things have occurred. The first thing that has occurred is that historians, like the people that are around History Reclaimed, have been complicit in hiding the real history of transgender people in Phoenicia and in ancient Israel, so they haven't really acknowledged what was there all along. So there's a kind of dishonesty about the history of the past. And the second thing they're claiming is an argument for their identity, that their identity goes back thousands of years and should be respected in that particular way. So that's really what I'm talking about here. And what I'm really suggesting is that what we're seeing today is something that's never happened before. It's never been the case that the past has been subjected to such systematic, corrosive kind of arguments, and to a veritable crusade that basically seeks to dehumanize what people did in the past. And very importantly, what it aims to do is to detach our society from any of the people, any of the experiences that have gone before us. In other words, detach, for example, British society from its historical legacy. And of course, once you detach society from its historical legacy, then basically we are no longer in any shape or form the products of the past. We are no longer the beneficiaries of all the positive things that have gone on beforehand. We become somebody very, very different. I just want to end by talking about what I see as being the 4 stages of the war on history. The first stage of the war on history begins to kick in on the 19th century. It's in the 19th century that you have the beginnings of modernism. And modernism adopts a fairly cavalier attitude towards the past. And it basically says, we know better than they did. We are much more capable of dealing with problems. And therefore, the past should no longer have the respect that it does in traditional societies. At that time, in the 19th century, their alienation from the past did not lead them to disrespect it. Even the most progressive people, from Karl Marx all the way to the utilitarians, still respected the past. And they basically still saw the past as a legacy that benefits society. But that's the beginning. The second stage kicks in the early 20th century, where American progressivism basically says that no longer is the past relevant, it's not relevant, but it's also an obstacle to progress. In other words, what they were arguing was that the past has become an obstacle to progress, so therefore, we should no longer teach Latin or Greek, we should no longer take history seriously, we should no longer be inspired by the people in the past who've nourished our imagination. Someone like John Dewey, the American progressive, really summed it well, when he basically said that the knowledge of the past and what the past offers us is best left behind. I think it's in that kind of moment when American progressivism begins to regard the past as somehow an obstacle to learning, when education needs to change, so it's more oriented towards the present, that something really important begins to shift and begins to change. But even then, at this second phase, people's relation to the past was one where now and again they would acknowledge that we're living on the shoulders of the giants. I mean, that whole expression still meant something to people because they recognized that John Dewey couldn't write his philosophy in the way that he did unless he was referring and using the insights of philosophers in the previous time. The third phase kicks in around the 1960s. And in the 1960s, you have a new insight. And the argument now is that not only is the past irrelevant, not only is the past an obstacle to progress, but actually the past is in some shape or form malevolent. Its influence is bad. And it's in this particular phase that you have a systematic attempt, first by the history profession and then by other sections of academia, where you're trying to deconstruct the past. You're trying to demonstrate that the heroic past that we've been learning about, the myths that are part of the every nation story, have somehow got to be seen as exercising a negative influence, that the values that are permeated through the past into our imagination are negative. So that's the third phase. And the fourth phase, and this is the phase that we're going through now, which emerges in the early 21st century, is one that basically argues that not only is the past irrelevant, not only is the past an obstacle to progress, not only is the past malevolent, but that the past represents a clear and present danger. In other words, that the past itself should come with a health warning, that the past itself represents a negative impact on our lives, and therefore we should regard the past as something that is a threat and represents a threat to our way of life. And if you look at the way in which there's been a systematic attempt to launch almost a holy crusade against the figures and the individuals of the past, you will see that something interesting has occurred, particularly in the culture war, as more and more people who are fighting the culture war against tradition, against the conventional ideals of Western civilization, have decided that they're going to enter the battlefield, and the battlefield is not in the present, but in the past. In other words, the temporal distinction between the present and the past has become eroded as more and more people feel that what they have to do is to put right all the horrible mistakes that were made 100 years ago, 200 years ago. And that's the story that we're kind of confronted with today. And the consequence of that, and the problem that we face with in the here and now, is what's being called into question are issues that aren't just simply to do with Britain or to England, but they're all civilizational in character. Because basically what's being called into question are the very premise on which civilization, not just Western civilization, but on which human civilization was constructed. Because what they are really saying, in a sense, is that the very word civilized is not only problematic, I mean, they've been saying that for decades. The word civilized itself is intrinsically racist. It's intrinsically oppressive. And therefore, civilized behavior in any shape or form is something that is being increasingly negated and called into question. You know, we're now coming into a world where human civilization itself and its achievements are systematically robbed of its positive content, where the past itself has become rendered so alien to our existence that many, many people no longer recognized that there is a past, no longer recognize that there's a temporal distinction between the present and the past. And you know, if that's the case, if we are deprived of our past, if the past becomes entirely alienated from us, then how do we know what's the road ahead? If we lost the guidance that the experience of human beings over thousands of years have given us, how are you and I able to decide which direction to move in? How can we teach our young people what their future is? More importantly, how can we even socialize our young people to anything that resembles a human legacy? What is it that we teach them about ourselves? What is it that we can say that can make them feel proud to be a human being or to be English? If we can no longer answer those questions, if we have detached young people from the past in such a systematic way, then it's not really surprising that young people become so disoriented and so confused that they will end up with all the problems of the current era. I think we have to understand that the stakes are really, really high. I think what historically doing is really important because we already lost 3 or 4 generations of young people who've been educated into being suspicious of the past or not taking the past seriously, never mind hating it. And we mustn't be in a situation where we allow ourselves to be so complacent that we will say that, okay, we lost 4 generations of young people. It's not a big deal if you lose the next generations. So that's what we're going to think about, because the issues that we're discussing here are matters of tremendous importance for the future of our society. And this isn't just simply a discussion about the past. It's about something much more fundamental. Thank you.
If the National Trust becomes preoccupied with a sense of being some great national institution, it will be in danger of making a fool of itself. Merlin Waterson wrote this in his centenary history of the charity 30 years ago, and he wasn't wrong. The National Trust won its place in the nation's heart by doing well what it was set up to do, protecting special places from damaging development and making them available for everyone to enjoy. Researching and presenting history was never among its charitable objects, but inasmuch as history has a role in the National Trust, the charity's task has been not to relate history, but to provide a context for the buildings and objects in its care. For decades, the National Trust quietly got on with researching and explaining. Historians of art and architecture produced guidebooks which often contained the latest original research. But now we find ourselves in a situation where the Director General of our oldest, largest, most beloved conservation charity, the National Trust, tells the press that she does not want to take part in the culture wars, while the Director of Communications holds forth furiously on Twitter about politically motivated attacks on the charity. Even the leader of His Majesty's opposition weighs in with a view that such a wonderful institution must be beyond criticism. How did we get here? Few of us saw this coming even a decade ago. Over the past few years, and especially since 2020, an ideological strand has become apparent in the interpretation of properties. This did not happen in isolation, but it follows a trend which has been even more marked in museums and galleries. The National Trust is under constant pressure from the decolonisers to keep doing more. At the conference at the Victoria and Albert, there were complaints that the National Trust was withholding certain family histories involving instances of racism. These criticisms were based on ignorance and misunderstandings, but no one in the room corrected them, possibly because no one present from the National Trust knew the facts. We founded Restore Trust in 2021 because we were dismayed at the erosion of standards at the charity of which we have been so proud. What can we do? We challenge the narrative of cardboard goodies and baddies. We draw attention to the failings in conservation and presentation. Passion is not a substitute for expertise. Moral certainty is not a substitute for honesty. We also support candidates who can bring greater expertise and a diversity of thought to the Governing Council. Are we going to succeed? The voting process at the AGM has been rebalanced sharply in favour of the hierarchy with the use of the quick vote. We will keep working away to show that there is an alternative way of looking after heritage and of presenting its history and context, as the Roman historian Tacitus had it, without partisanship or indignation.
I had spent 3 years training to be a gardener at Kew and had come to love the institution. And I feared for its stellar international reputation and the integrity of its past. When an organisation slips its moorings, my husband, who's a retired judge at the back there, usually says, "Look to the founding documents." So I did. Kew's powers and duties are set out in the National Heritage Act of 1983, which also governs a number of other cultural or scientific institutions, including the Victoria and Albert Museum, the Army Museums, and the Science Museum. In the clauses that dealt with Kew, I discovered that its statutory remit was extremely narrow, namely the science of plants. I wrote this in a letter to the Spectator, pointing out that therefore the Board of Trustees who had okayed the manifesto might be acting ultra vires. In other words, outside its statutory remit and therefore unlawfully. Kew's pronouncements around the manifesto contained, along with a great deal of sound scientific content, as you'd expect, material which was overtly and contentiously political. I can best give the flavour by quoting the director of Kew, Richard Devil, who in an interview with The Guardian in June 2020 said, and I quote, "Parts of Kew's history shamefully draw from a legacy that has deep roots in colonialism and racism. We will move quickly to decolonise our collections, and we shouldn't forget that plants were central to the running of the British Empire." The paper, entitled "Politicising Plants," was published at the end of December 2021. A subsequent article by me was published by History Reclaimed. The Policy Exchange paper is still on its website, so I don't need to rehearse the details. Suffice it to say that 10 days after its publication, Deverell climbed down publicly, issuing a statement saying the word decolonisation would be removed. Quote, "We are emphatically not disrespecting or censoring our history, nor are we apologising, nor are we removing any items from display." He told the Daily Telegraph with Olympian grandeur that he had at first been amused, then annoyed by the criticism that Kew had received, because it was, quote, "a distraction." He described Kew's plans as a touch on the tiller. Some may wonder how that squares with decolonising the whole of plant science. So, a small victory, which in what is turning out to be a long war. But what this engagement taught me was that the power in this public institution, and possibly many others as well, in reality rests with the executive, the people on the ground. The Board of Trustees, usually composed of very busy and very important people, have not the information or the will to gainsay the executive when on a mission. And there was no help to be had from DEFRA, who have the statutory oversight of Kew, the exercise of which is especially important, as nearly half of its income comes from you and me, the taxpayer. Despite this awkward little controversy, the director of Kew was honoured with a CBE last year, and the chairman of the Board of Trustees was reappointed. This spat has also taught me that these organisations need to be watched forever after, and it's not easy. Trying to discern whether the change of heart at Kew has been substantial or merely semantic, I have tried to see the board minutes. I will not weary you with the delays and obfuscations. When the minutes of the meeting that succeeded Deverell's public statement were eventually published, his contribution was so heavily redacted to be virtually non-existent. It does not inspire confidence that Deverell and Antonelli are still in post, and neither, as far as I know, has said that his earlier statements were wrong. A sense of unease has hardly been dispelled by Kew, treating the public last November to a botanically and plant physiologically preposterous month of events celebrating queer nature. How the proper scientists at Kew must have winced. I should like to add a coda about another national institution, the British Library. In 2022, an interpretation plaque appeared there beneath a bust of that great friend of Kew, the botanical explorer and major philanthropist, Sir Joseph Banks. The plaque accused Banks of being a murderer, kidnapper, and a symbol of violence and oppression. I informed Professor Toombs, who complained to the chair of the library's trustees, having already elicited an expert rebuttal from a distinguished New Zealand historian, Professor Paul Moon. It took a year, but the plaque has finally been changed. And this leads me to the main point I should like to make, that anyone who wants to be the eyes and ears of historical and cultural pushback needs an organisation to publicise its researches. And in this regard, I should like to pay a warm tribute to History Reclaimed, because in the short time it has operated, those involved have worked incredibly hard to provide the rigorous and empirically based historical underpinning for that pushback. Those of us who feel we're ploughing a seemingly lonely furrow can take heart from their intellectual rigour and desire for an informed and civil dialogue, rather than highly politicised megaphone statements made by cultural warriors. I would also like to say this to the audience here today. All of you can make a difference, and it's vital that you do. And should you find yourselves in the same situation over an institution as I was over Kew, then look to the Constitution, Charter, or statutory obligations that apply, or research the archive concerned with its foundation. You might just find the ammunition that you need to make that difference. Thank you.
Good afternoon. I can't help but feel sometimes when I come to these things that, we're preaching to the converted and, everyone on the stage, feel you're nodding along and you're thinking, I completely agree. But is there a solution, or are we just agreeing that there are lots of problems in society that we all know about? And I know that Ursula just there spoke about some of the things we can do. So not being an academic and being a policymaker or working in the policy sphere, I think I should focus more on the policy side of things. And in order to answer the question of what can we do about this, I think we need first to look at why is this happening, and why have our institutions become distracted, and why are they focusing on things that are completely outside their remits. One of the reasons, of course, is virtue signalling. If the fashion is to be talking about Black Lives Matter or some other trendy causes, the institutions are going to latch onto that, and we've seen that particularly in recent years. And it's not, we know it's virtue signalling rather than genuinely feeling that this is a good thing to be doing or the best way to make society better, because Black Lives Matter, for example, didn't come about as a result of all of the wars going on, the terrible wars going on in Africa that have caused humanitarian crises on a huge level, or they didn't happen because the movement didn't come about because of the large rate of Afro-Caribbean knife crime against fellow Afro-Caribbean young men. So it's not actually that Black lives matter in the eyes of these people in a sort of commonsensical way. And so when people say, oh, you're saying you don't support Black Lives Matter, you must be racist. Actually, I think there's very good reason to be slightly suspicious of a cause that only came about because a criminal with a despicable criminal record whose kin happened to be black, the fact that that was what caused Black Lives Matter to come about says a lot about the entire movement. And so we saw all these institutions in the wake of Black Lives Matter rolling over themselves to sort of show how supportive they were of the movement, and bringing on new EDI officials and opening up entire anti-racism task forces. And we know that anti-racism is not the same thing as non-racism, of course. But why is this happening? I mean, that still doesn't completely explain why an institution would go through the effort of doing all of that just because it's trendy. And I think the reason actually goes a long way back, and this is, the latest virtue signalling stuff is merely a symptom of a much longer standing trend of, which is basically ultra-commercialization. And these places will do, a lot of these institutions have been doing whatever's in their funding interests for a very long time. And if that means, focusing more on the cafe than the institution itself, then that has been one of the things they've been doing, and that's gone back a long way, as we know. If it means, the National Trust con thing was not at all about it being woke because they were choosing vegan, choosing to make them vegan by replacing butter with margarine, I think, but rather because margarine is much cheaper than butter. So, they love the fact that some people call that woke, because it's a very easy thing for them to attack. It's like, oh, look at these total nutters, they're calling it woke. Whereas actually, if someone were, looked into it and thought about it for 5 minutes, they'd think, okay, this is just the latest example of the National Trust trying to cut costs, even if that means a decline in the quality of their output. And it hasn't, of course, led to a decline in the price of scones. So, they've benefited. And so that's just one example. They get a lot of funding out of doing EDI stuff. The Arts Council England, the Arts and Humanities Research Council specifically want to see EDI stuff happening, otherwise they're not convinced for some reason that the institution is doing worthwhile work for society. They think that people are going to feel outcast if you're not showing them that, oh, we really care about you. And they don't really see that that's very patronising. As you can probably see, I'm not white, but I can go somewhere and I can appreciate the art or the architecture or whatever, and I don't have to be constantly reminded that don't worry, so do we, we really like you even though you're brown. I don't really need that, and I don't think that many people appreciate it. So I don't really know why it's going on apart from to rake in all that funding. But the sad thing is, and this is another reason why things have gone wrong, that the biggest funders haven't noticed that this is going on. The biggest funders aren't the Arts Council, it's not the Arts and Humanities Research Council, it's not the Heritage Lottery Fund often. It's those massive funders, the people who, if they were in this room, would entirely agree with us. But do they realise that all this is going on? Do they make their voice heard in the sense of, I'm giving you millions, and the reason I'm giving you millions is not to do EDI stuff, it's to protect this stuff, it's to preserve it and make sure that people in the future will be able to visit these places and enjoy this art or enjoy these artefacts. I'm not entirely convinced that they have fully realised the extent to which all this stuff is happening. And governments have of course let us down as well. We've had I wrote about this the other day in the Telegraph, but we've had a Conservative government, but what has it done to actively conserve our heritage? Apart from talking about it, not very much, not as much as one would have expected a Conservative government to do, and it's under their watch and under their, oversight that all of this EDI stuff has been allowed to proliferate. And just one example, just in case you're sort of wondering to what extent does all this stuff have to do with funding, you might have noticed a couple of years ago, or maybe it was last year or perhaps the year before that, the Wellcome Trust announced that it was looking for someone to fill an equity, diversity and inclusion officer post, which was a 2-day-a-week post that was going to be, the salary for it was £211,500. Quite what that person would do to deserve such a huge salary, I have no idea. But anyway, that was announced, and I was looking at this, looking into it, and they'd got a PDF, which of course they took down as soon as the post was filled. But they'd got a PDF showing the history of EDI at the Wellcome Trust. And looking through that, they had a timeline, and it all started with, I think it was 2015 or 2016, the Wellcome Trust gets X amount of money for starting doing EDI stuff, starting doing diversity stuff. So I thought, okay, there's a direct link there, even, in their archives. The timeline begins with them getting a grant for starting this sort of stuff, and it sort of has snowballed from there, and particularly, I think, since the Black Lives Matter thing, it's become huge and, has risen exponentially. What can we do to make a difference? Because we all care. Well, I think many people in this room care about this stuff. And there are lots of different ways we can make a difference. Anybody can join the board of these institutions. If you particularly care about an institution, these vacancies come up all the time to be a trustee. And in fact, if you're thinking, oh, nobody knows who I am or whatever, that's even better reason for you to apply, because everyone knows that I'm not a particularly convenient person to have on one's board, so I don't think I'm ever again going to be appointed to a board. But anyone in this room who cares about this stuff, if you have the if you've got some botanical experience and you're thinking about Kew Gardens, or you have an interest in art and design, therefore might apply for the V&A. Technically, if you tick the boxes of those qualifications, then you should be interviewed at least. So everyone has a chance of getting a position somewhere in an area of interest or expertise, their experience. And another thing isn't just not to remain silent. If you go to one of these museums and you spot something wrong, you don't necessarily have to write a paper. Of course, Ursula is right that that's one way you can do it. But you can write to the newspapers, or if you know someone in the think tank world or policy or whatever, you can share that story with someone. It grows legs sometimes, and it gets somewhere, and something is done about it. Because all that's needed is these institutions to be prodded and show that what they're doing is outside their remit, and often they don't really realise that it's outside their remit, and they stop. And lastly, on the subject of the National Trust, which is a subject close to my heart, of course. I recently wrote a paper for the Legatum Institute, which showed why a lot of this stuff is going wrong. And of course, the roots of it are, you know, the ultra-commercialisation, then the vicious circle, which always happens of vertu-signaling, and they get rid of the curators and bring in young people who are less qualified, but also already believe in that sort of stuff. So there is a lot of, the causes are many, but one of the ways they've been able to control things is by changing the entire voting system and changing the AGM voting system, so they no longer send out ballot papers to members as of, you know, this year. They've changed the voting system 2 years ago so that it's a completely warped, you know, thing where nobody who's not recommended by the council can get elected, or the National Trust leadership can get elected. But if sufficient pressure is placed on the Charity Commission, then they might be able to change that, because frankly, the National Trusts have gone about making these changes in ways that completely lack integrity, and they've lied to members, and things like that. I mean, you can find out more about it by reading my paper if you're interested. But with things like this, one can write to the Charity Commission, and then one can also FOI the Charity Commission to ask how many complaints have gone in there. And the Charity Commission has its own responsibility to make sure that charities are being run according to their charitable objects, and also that charity trustees are fulfilling their responsibilities. So I just urge everyone to use all means available to, you know, I know Frank Furedi said he doesn't like raising awareness, but actually raising awareness can sometimes be good. Thank you very much.
We've been doing our bit. We've been publishing things on the website. We've been organising things like this. But of course, the effect, and we have been having, I think, some influence on people in positions of some authority. Though I think one would have to say that the measurable result has actually been quite small. And I cannot but agree with Zoditu that a great opportunity has been lost over the last few years by a government that was not really all that interested. They were not hostile, but they were not very interested. And if I might just briefly say before asking you to contribute, is I had quite a lot of experience, and I feel myself to have been a complete failure in helping to select trustees for great national cultural institutions. And this was an opportunity, or it should have been, to widen the set of opinions of people on these boards. It proved to be very difficult, and it's partly because of the way that the civil service draws up the job description, which is, I think, deliberately restrictive. So it doesn't say things like, we want people who have wider, even lived experience regarding this. We want people from outside who are new to this world, who can express the opinions of the general public. It's never that. It's always people who are insiders, in some senses, of the system. And it's a very good way of excluding people and excluding fresh voices. And the civil servants and the existing trustees don't want anyone who will rock the boat. And often candidates for these positions want to have a nice socially prestigious position, and they're not in the mood to cause any trouble. And that's just perfect for the institution, which is largely run, as you said, by its permanent staff. And then ministers, and I don't want to put the boot into the present government, there are plenty of other people doing that. But I did have a conversation with a minister at a reception a few weeks ago. He said, I really want to talk to you about trustee appointments. I'll give you a ring. Of course he never did. And okay, there's an election, we know that. But I think the government has been shown a great lack of enterprise. And I don't think it's entirely their fault, because we know that the civil service can make life difficult for ministers, though you might say, well, that's part of the job. Many of you will have read Lord Ridley, Matt Ridley's piece in The Spectator about the blob. And he pointed out that something which I hadn't realised, is that if ministers go against advice, then there can be a judicial review. So what happens in the case of the appointment of trustees is that the selection panel draws up a list of candidates that they regard as appointable. Now, nearly all the candidates are appointable, but they draw up a short list of candidates that they say are appointable, which means the ones that they really like, the ones who won't cause any trouble. And they send that to ministers. Ministers have the right to appoint anybody, But in my experience, they will not appoint anybody who's not on the list. And hence, ministers have no, or at least do not take any initiative of their own. They accept what is recommended to them by the people who are already there and their officials. And so, I mean, I think the government should have made an effort of the kind that you described, the sort of Tony Blair effort to get people into positions of influence who represented a wide variety of views, but they didn't do that.
This move away from what you might call more traditional mainstream historical research and the politicisation of historical research, it is something that we're very much aware of. Unfortunately, it begins obviously lower down the system. You can see the new Cambridge undergraduate syllabus, you can see a lot of that. There is this problem with the sort of subjects that PhD students are doing, which actually get funding. And when it then comes to the next stage, postdoctoral research, more and more people being elected to these very prestigious junior research fellowships who are doing, shall we say, fashionable subjects. I will add, as an advertisement, I have to say, for another organisation of which I am president and trustee, but the Faros Foundation, which is actually based in Oxford, we are coming up with hard money for postdoctoral research. We elected our first 6 last year. We're hoping to elect 3 to 6 in the coming year to maintain people for 3 or 4 years doing postdoctoral research in traditional mainstream research. And ultimately, I would hope that we can also fund people a bit lower down the sort of research ladder, if you like. But this is a very serious problem that all sorts of areas of research are just being shut out at the moment, and without proper funding, things will just go from bad to worse.
Well, on that note, I think we're going to have to stop. But it's a very both encouraging and challenging, I think. I think you've all asked us to do a lot more things. We'll have to run it over. It probably means we need a lot more money and a lot more people. But thank you for all your suggestions. Thank you for being here. And I think it's been a very good day. I think the atmosphere has been encouraging to us, I think. It makes me feel that perhaps we haven't been entirely wasting our time. Oh, that's true, yes, of course. And thank you for reminding me, because I had thought of this earlier and then it slipped my mind. Lawrence is the man who has done all the organising. And it's on his shoulders that 90% of our activities rest. So I'd like to thank him.
Tea and, I hope, a glass of wine. I'm going to pop off. See you in the chair.